Okay, now that's not possible. Magic. So good morning.
Good morning.
And I will tell you all that I just dropped the microphone because I forgot to put a belt on this morning. If my pants should happen to fall off during the sermon, please pretend that there's nothing wrong. I want to actually tell you what didn't make it into this sermon because I think it's so interesting. And I want to spark some intrigue amongst you. And that is, as I was researching Emerson, looking at this, I came across an essay, a research essay entitled Emerson's Gnostic Democracy. So for those of you who have any idea what a Gnostic is someone who's in direct relationship with God in the Christian tradition. And so the idea of Emerson's Gnostic democracy is something that, I'm still tangled, is something that is really intriguing. But in the interest of getting you out of here by 2 or 3 p.m., I left it out of what I was going to do today. So it'll have to come at another time. So I want to start off with a story this morning. And it's a story that I'm just shamelessly stealing from a mentor. And he's a very wise man who listens and sees very well. And the story starts with a family. And they're in a car. And they are on their way to get some special cupcakes. And these are not normal cupcakes. They're the special cupcakes. Right? They're the big frosting, the rich cake, the kind you have to drive an hour to go get. Okay? You all know the kind of cupcakes I'm talking about. So, the family drives an hour to get the magic cupcakes. Well, special. And in the car, we have Grandpa, who's visiting. All right? We have parents, mom and dad, we have brother and sister, and we have young girl. Young girl was named young girl because she wasn't quite 5 yet. So the interesting part of our story starts on the drive back. Not that the search for cupcakes wasn't interesting, but the really interesting stuff starts on the drive back. And young girl is holding the cupcakes and Gunpa is watching her. And she insisted on holding the cupcakes for the drive back. Now Gunpa is watching her, and the way he tells this story, he says he watched this happen. Which kind of makes you wonder why he didn't say or do anything, right? But he watched it happen. He watched a look come across young girl's face. Maybe mischievous, maybe just grumpy about the drive, but definitely a look. And young girl took the tray of cupcakes and turned it upside down and threw it on the floor of the car. Yeah, I hear a few parents chuckling, right? Very deliberately slammed it on the floor of the car. Now our family had already gone too far towards home. It was too close to home and didn't have time to go back and get more cupcakes. So too far, too late, the special cupcakes are now slammed and all smashed up. And you can imagine the chaos that ensued. This young girl, she sat with her arms folded across her chest, pouting, frustrated, angry, mad at everyone, or because they were mad at her, or maybe because the cupcakes were now smashed. I don't know. What goes through the mind of a young girl when she does something like that? So, anyways, you might imagine the pouting went on through the family for days on end, right? The fighting, the pouting, the brother and sister blaming her for smashing the cupcakes and her calling them names or whatever. Until finally, in his frustration, Dad said to young girl, "You need to go to church so you can forgive yourself for the cupcakes." And young girl looked at her father and said, "That's not why you go to church." Now, Gunpa, always listening for wisdom in the world, got that twinkle in his eye. And he asked her, "Well then, why do you go to church, young girl?" "Gunpa, you go to church so you can get better at finding God." "Oh, you do? Well, where do you find God, young girl?" "At the rope park, Gunpa. I find God at the rope park." Now, Gunpa thought about this for a minute and said, "Do you know where I found God?" "Where, Gunpa?" When the wind rustles through the trees in the leaves, I see God there. I see God there too, Goomba. Our first source says direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. In my soul imagination, where legend lives, filled with stories of kids hanging out with God at rope parks, where wise men listen to the holy as it whispers in the trees, our first source is very important. It's perhaps even the most important of our sources, the first source. Now, Reverend Kathleen Rollins, who is an ILIF graduate like me, is quoted on the UUA website above our list of 6 sources. Throughout history, we have moved to the rhythms of mystery and wonder, prophecy, wisdom, teachings from ancient, modern stories, and nature herself. Moved to the rhythms of mystery and wonder. Prophecy, wisdom, teachings from ancient and modern sources, and nature herself. The first of our 6 sources, the direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder, which moves us to renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces that create and uphold life. It descends from our transcendentalist heritage. Many of you know the names of some of the prominent transcendentalists: Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose reading we just read before the service; Henry David Thoreau, whose opening to Walden I read for our opening words; Margaret Fuller, who is known for calling out and saying, "I embrace the universe," reaching up with her arms, and for her activism in women's rights before the Civil War. Of the Transcendentalists, Reverend Joan Johnson Lewis writes on his site transcendentalists.com, the Transcendentalists can be understood in one sense by their context, by what they were rebelling against, what they saw as the current situation, and therefore as what they were trying to be different from. They were responding to social pressures and cultural changes in pre-Civil War America in the 1820s and 1830s. They wanted to create literature that was uniquely American. Because if you think about it, that's not that long after the American Revolution. What literature, what heritage would have been uniquely American at that point? Literature and prose that articulated the spirit and sense of a new age. The Transcendentalists articulated a spirituality that reflected rebellion against unjust authority, oppression, and over materialism. Now, did you know that Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau called the Unitarian Church stuffy? Reverend Roger Jones writes that Thoreau didn't go to any church. We like to claim it, but he didn't go to any church. He did hang around with many Unitarians, though, especially those who had left the Unitarian Church, like Ralph Waldo Emerson. They said it had become staid, stuffy, snooty, tradition-bound, and unspiritual. Their thinking is not only central to our first source, but also our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of all people. God gave humanity certain gifts: intuition, insight, inspiration, reason. Transcendentalists were called to use those gifts to write poetry, prose, reflections, preach, engage in social justice. They based their readings on the belief that a loving God would never lead humanity astray. And so they found truth in all sacred texts. And they were among the first Americans to read and use non-Western texts from Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism. Their measure of truth included whether or not it agreed with an individual's sense of conscience and intuition of truth. Many Transcendentalists were involved in social reform movements, especially anti-slavery and women's rights. We've heard Reverend Patty talk about Theodore Parker, who was part of the Underground Railroad and who was one of the preachers who kept a revolver in his desk. That he might not because he was given to violence, but that he might look out for the slaves that he was hiding in his church building. The Transcendentalists believed that through every human soul, all people had access to divine inspiration. All souls naturally seek and love freedom, knowledge, and truth. All souls are worthy and blessed. Direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. I see God in the trees too, Goompa. Now, the start of the Transcendentalist movement is generally credited to the publication of Nature by Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1836. In Nature, Emerson pays homage to the spiritual issue that human beings do not fully accept or welcome nature's grace or beauty. Emerson laments overdependence on tradition, history, and texts. He writes, "Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes bibliographies, histories, and criticisms. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face. We, through their eyes." Emerson wanted to call people to seek the holy themselves through their experience of the natural world. I personally find his writing inspirational and beautiful. In the woods is perpetual youth. Within these plantations of God, a decorum and sanctity reign. A perennial festival is dressed, and the guest sees not how he should tire of them in 1,000 years. In the woods, we return to reason and faith. There I feel that nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity, leaving me my eyes, which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing, I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. I become a transparent eyeball, part or particle of God. I find it really fun that I belong to a faith that invites us to become transparent eyeballs. I see God in the rope park, Goompa. I think our young girls' ideas about church are transcendentalist. You go to church to learn how to find God better. You can almost hear it going, sheesh. That does not sound like the stuffy, staid, snooty, and non-spiritual church against which the Transcendentalists rebelled. Now, Emerson did study sacred texts, not just nature, but he studied them to find his own understanding of them. In her sermon about Emerson and the origins of our first source, the Reverend Gretchen Woods wrote, "I find it fascinating that Emerson was among the first to translate the Sufi poets, notably Hafez into English. In April of 1846, he discovered Hafez, now stay with me on this name, he discovered Hafez through a copy of Joseph von Hammer der Diwan von Manhabij Shemsed Din Hafiz. He soon became enthralled with the work of Hafez, the 14th century Sufi master and greatest of the Persian lyric poets. Emerson eventually filled a 250-page notebook with translations from Persian poets, mostly Hafez. Every line of every poem testified that the spiritual appears to us only through the senses. For Hafez and Emerson, religion is ecstatic, sensual, and filled with joy, rather than the corpse-cold Christianity of his native New England at the time. The Sufis came to the perspective of human being as potentially immanent and transcendent long before Emerson and deeply affected his thinking about mystery and wonder. The Sufi sense of Allah is immanent and present in art, poetry, music, nature, beauty. Is a faith fueled by sensuality and joy, in tune with the natural world. That faith lives powerfully in my own soul imagination. I see God at the rope park, and maybe in the midst of all this, we have some insight into that young girl that started the story, where the story got interesting. Then again, who really knows the mind of a young girl? But still sitting there with this tray of fluffy, magic icing, rich cupcakes, balanced in your lap for nearly an hour, with everybody in the car just focused on the cupcakes for the whole drive. Wouldn't some part of you eventually want to turn that box over to see what happens? To have that experience? I mean, if you didn't have all of this critique and reason that guides your thinking in every day, wouldn't some part of you just want to see what happens? So for those of you that were here last week, we reflected on ways that Catholic scholar Richard Guillardi sees how technology influences our lives, the ways it can distance us from our sense of connectedness, and drawing our attention away from our shared focal practices, such as gathering around a household fire for warmth and company, or the way it can provide us with hyper-real representations of the natural world. And the example he gives is Walt Disney's Wild Kingdom, which presents us with a representation of the wilds of creation that may look wild, but which manages to protect us from the unpredictability of dangerous animals, or better or worse, protect us from the dangers of unprepared, uneven, and unpaved ground. Dr. Guillardi never suggests that we should abandon our technology. Instead, perhaps suggests some intentional reflection about how technology draws us apart and alters our perception of the world. He suggests that that intentional reflection might help us identify and retain more of our connecting human practices. That direct experience of mystery and wonder that connects us to each other, to what feels holy and sacred, the forces that create and uphold life. Like Guillardi, Emerson was concerned with the materialism of his world. And like Guillardi, Emerson called people into spiritual relationship with the natural world around him. Reverend Audette Fulbright, who now serves a congregation in Wyoming, wrote, "The transcendentalist heresy, or awakening, depending on your perspective, was that the affirmation that we do not need clergy, priests, or religion itself to mediate our experience to God or to discover meaning and truth. Rather, it's the inalienable right and duty of every soul to directly approach God. Indeed, there is no other way to know the holy than to experience it through creation and through nature." I remember when I was young, the way that God smelled. The running of cold forest stream drifting across the stones and earth, filling the sense of earthy creation shadows in my nostrils. Cool air brushing the edges of skin, still small brook babbling, ringing in the dusk of day, welcoming the shadows. So let me leave you with another story, one that I hope will grant some humor in parting, while also offering some reflection. It's adapted from a sermon called Garden Graces by Reverend Ann C. Fox. God and St. Francis are talking. And God says, "St. Francis, you know all about gardens and nature. What in the world is going on down there in the USA? What happened to the buttercup, sage, balsam root, violets, thistle, and stuff I started eons ago? I had a perfect no-maintenance garden plan. Those plants grow in any type of soil, withstand drought, and multiply with abandon. The nectar from the long-lasting blossoms attracts butterflies, honeybees, flocks of songbirds. I expected to see a vast garden of colors by now. but all I see are these green rectangles. St. Francis says, it's the tribes that settled there, Lord, the suburbanites. They started calling your flowers weeds and went to great lengths to kill them and replace them with grass. Grass? That seems boring. It's not colorful. It doesn't attract butterflies, birds, and bees. Only grubs and sodworms. It's temperamental with temperatures. Do these suburbanites really want all that grass growing there? Apparently so, Lord. They go to great pains to grow it and keep it green. They begin each spring by fertilizing grass and poisoning any other plant that crops up on the lawn. Well, at least the rains and warm weather probably make the grass grow really fast. My rains and warm weather must make the suburbanites happy. Apparently not, Lord. As soon as it grows a little, they cut it, sometimes twice a week. They cut it? Do they bale it like hay? Not exactly, Lord. Most of them break it up and put it in bags. They bag it? Why? Is it a cash crop? Do they sell it? No, Lord, just the opposite. They pay people to throw it away. So I think when we look at our natural world, when we consider the heritage we come from, there's any number of ways to look at what it offers us. Thank you. Please rise and body your spirit for the singing of our closing hymn, which is hymn number 21.